Rachel, and I appreciate that introduction. So just to let everybody know, in the chat, I did post an interactive portion, so you may want to try to click on that link just to make sure that it works for you. If it doesn't, don't worry, I'm going to be sharing screen the whole time, so you'll get to see everybody else interacting, and you can like shout at us whatever you wanted to put in the interactive portion. So today we're going to be talking about trade-offs, and I'm going to talk to you about a method that we've been developing for tying national decarbonization models with environmental sustainability inequality analyses. At the beginning of the session, our gracious host talked about how low carbon transitions does not guarantee like reaching the multiple dimensions of environmental sustainability. I'm also going to extend that to say decarbonization does not inherently guarantee equity and equality. And so we want to understand how, as we are transitioning these technologies, what impact is that going to have on populations at a subnational level? So speaking of interactive portions, let's get that started. So the first one is going to be, what do you think of when you hear of sustainable energy transitions? I see some anonymous animals jumping ahead. Let's not do that. It ruins the point of interaction. So we're going to go to slide 2. And we're gonna you can drag the X's. So everybody who has that link should be able to edit this PowerPoint. You should drag an X to what your main energy sustainability concern is. So we have total air pollution, reducing the distribution of air pollution, ecological impacts on fish, creating jobs, unequal energy costs, and water quality. Again, I can see you jumping ahead. You don't want to do that. We all want to party on slide 2. And we do want all your voices to be heard, which is the goal of equality. So let's see. Oh, I'm going to resend the link. Okay, there's the link again for all those that were wondering where it was. And it is in the chat in case you missed that one. So the races are off, dun, dun, dun. And we see that, okay, we have one person that can't make up their mind between reducing air pollution and the distribution of air pollution. But in general, most people are saying that total air pollution is their main energy sustainability concern. And that is something that has been consistent with hearing about, getting to net zero by 2035, getting to net zero by 2050. Again, it's always about how can we reach net zero as quickly as possible, but not necessarily saying, well, should we get to net zero by 2035, or should we make sure that by 2035, everybody has the same exact quality of air? Now, if we get to net zero by 2035, that's great because everybody has the same quality of air. But let's say that we don't for some reason, like there's, some people that are disrupting energy transition, slowing that thing down, then we may have missed an opportunity to reduce the highest polluting plants first, for example. So that's kind of where this reducing air pollution, total, can sometimes contradict with the distribution and that sort of thing. So let's go to slide 3. So let's just assume that we're taking out that total one, because I kind of knew you guys were all going to say that, well, not all of you guys, but most of you guys would say that one was the majority. So let's talk about energy equality, and energy equality is the only thing on the table. So then now, what's your main energy equality concern? Is it access to electricity, access to jobs, people's ability to make comfortable indoor temperatures, reducing forced outages? So that would be like that Texas disaster that we saw, right? Outages during those wildfires, unequal energy costs. So can people actually afford the energy? Can they pay those bills? And then distribution of pollution. Again, that ties to those health impacts. Oh, somebody's stuck on slide 1. Come on, Flaga. I don't even know how to pronounce that animal. Google always makes you guys anonymous. So don't worry, we have no idea what you guys are saying. The only one who's not anonymous is this girl or this woman, this doctor even. Okay, anonymous buffaloes. Oh wait, so some people on slide 2. Dun, dun, dun. This one seems to be a lot harder for people, right? Because I think we had a lot more responses on that slide too. So the main thing here is that when we are saying that we want an equitable energy transition, the first thing that we all need to do is get on the same page about what exactly that means, right? So talking about equity and equality in like a general sense may actually lead us to be unhappy and have large disagreements across populations, because we didn't have the same definition of equality, because everybody is thinking of like a different main energy equality concern, right? And so that's like a big challenge with, you know, working with different decision makers and getting everybody on the same page, is first making sure that we all had that same definition. Okay, I know you guys are probably tired of the interaction, but we're going to keep going. We're going to keep this party train rolling. So we're going to go to slide 4 now. And the question here is, which technology do you all believe is the most sustainable? We have solar, wind, natural gas, and hydro. Oh, whoop. Somebody's like moving all the stuff. It's okay. Just move the X's. Don't worry about all the other boxes. All right, so right now we seem like we have an even split between wind and hydro. Uh-oh, I have to move that back. Dun, dun, dun. All right, surprisingly, nobody said solar yet. That's actually super surprising to me. I think this is the first time in the history of doing this presentation that that's ever happened. So, and then I think that I'm gonna have to speculate here because we don't have time to ask everybody why you guys chose what you chose. But, you know, hydro oftentimes is thought of as being like a very large renewable resource. So then you can get that baseload generation. I think wind has a lot of distributional aspects. I'm actually surprised to see a natural gas person. So, you know, you guys are doing a lot of firsts for me here. So let's do something that's a little bit harder. And we're going to the last interactive portion of this presentation, which is slide 5. So the technology side of things probably was a little bit easier for some of you. Whoops. But let's talk about the combination, right? Because we know that energy transitions will never just have one technology. So let's assume that we had a system that is 50% natural gas, 50% solar, and a system that's 50% natural gas, 50% wind. Which one then would you think is the most sustainable? All right, we're pretty evenly split right now. And it seems like a lot of people have chosen to abstain from voting, which is a choice in itself. You guys are all free to make that choice. But like one of the things that I find really, really challenging when asking people this question is that the truth is it definitely depends, right? If you're in a place where there's not a lot of sun, solar, not going to be the most sustainable option, most likely. If you're in a place with a high amount of wind, you might go to the like wind farm. Some people say that wind farms are more sustainable because you can put them offshore and tie them in. So it really depends on like where you are, how these resources are interacting with each other, and you know, how you view that in terms of, again, those main sustainability concerns, right? And so again, it all ties back to those objectives and like what you are thinking of in terms of like energy transition. All right, so we're going to go back to the main PowerPoint. Oops, okay. So, and again, each of these things have different sustainability concerns stemming from them. So with solar, often you hear of scalability, variability, and unequal adoption rates, like especially when you think of rooftop solar. Natural gas, of course, is air pollution. And then with hydro concerns, we think about droughts and water use, especially in places like sub-Saharan Africa and California. So in my group, if you guys didn't know by now, you're in a trade-off talk. And so we really focus on like trade-offs between development and transition, which is where I would place that economic pillar of sustainability, environmental sustainability, and equality, which of course is that social side of sustainability. And our main, driving force behind this like research agenda is needing a way to quantify these trade-offs, because when you are looking at system level sustainability and system level equality and national transitions, you want to know exactly where you're winning and losing. And if we can do this in like a forward-looking way, we might have a better chance of understanding where people win and lose and trying to help compensate some people that feel like they may be on the losing end of energy transition. So when we're thinking about the three main pillars that we're going to be trading off between, some of the ways that decarbonization may impact the different sustainability and equality pillars if we're looking at cost and environmental sustainability, we might ask questions like, how does minimizing the overall cost of building the system impact environmental and health outcomes? And then for cost and distributional equity, we can look at how low carbon investment is tied to different income areas and different vulnerability groups. And then for environmental sustainability and distributional equity, we're really concerned with that distribution of air pollution across regions. And we can also think about the distribution of like water consumption, land use across regions, as well as costs and job metrics. So let's talk about the way we currently make decisions. So typically when we're moving from our present system to the future, the least cost paradigm drives optimization models. You have some system that you want to build and you're going to optimize it in the least cost way to build your system to satisfy your demand, some environmental constraints, and maybe you're going to throw in some equity constraints in there. And so our overall analysis framework is actually trying to understand how using that least cost paradigm that we currently is driving our energy transitions, how that actually leads to different trade-offs across costs, environmental sustainability, and distributional equity. So we start with decarbonization scenarios, which I will explain all the decarbonization scenarios we include in our model in the next slide. These will feed into an electricity system planning model, which is the REES model created by the National Renewable Energy Lab. And that's going to allow us to tie these national decarbonization goals with a sub-national regional analysis. That model is going to output the generation, the system cost, and where we're going to build transmission and power plant investments. And then we are going to feed this into a cost analysis, an environmental sustainability analysis, and a distributional equity and equality analysis. And then all of these things will feed into a trade-off analysis so we can understand where we're winning and losing under these different decarbonization scenarios. We include multiple scenarios. This is really to capture some of the national debates that we see in the United States right now. That base case is if all current policies and standards are included. And then B and C represent the carbon cap scenarios. And so one would be like a carbon cap in line with the nationally determined contributions, which were stated at the Paris Climate Agreement, and also limiting to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Then D through H actually is the technology specific requirements. So that's going to be where we see the 100% renewable energy by 2050 or 2030 or 2035. Then we also have the low carbon cases where it's just changing the technologies that you're allowed to use. But again, you're having like strict deadlines for those limits. So here are some modeling output results from the REES model. Again, it does show, it predicts which technologies will be used under different scenarios. So along the x-axis, you have the years. Along the y-axis, you have the generation and petawatt hours. And again, I'm showing you just three scenarios, mostly due to not wanting to overwhelm you on one slide, but we do this for all of the scenarios that I mentioned in the previous slide. And so here, we see that each of the different decarbonization scenarios is leading to vastly different technology deployment. In the base case, of course, we see a lot of coal, which is that black, and gas, which is brown. I should also say that nuclear is red. Hydro is that darker blue, wind is that lighter blue, and solar is that yellow. The green is going to be storage, and those are the main colors you're going to see on these graphs. Then with 2035, we see a very sharp cutoff, of course, by 2035 for the fossil fuels plus nuclear. And that gap is primarily filled with onshore wind, followed by solar PV and concentrated solar power. Now, the main difference with the low carbon case by 2035 is allowing coal to extend a little bit longer, but also allowing natural gas with CCS, or carbon capture and storage, as well as allowing nuclear technology to supply energy to the system. And this leads to less concentrated solar power and storage needs. Our sustainability analysis first focuses on emissions, both operational and life cycle emissions. So the emissions here is calculated using the emissions rate for technology I multiplied by the generation for technology I. And of course, this is summed over the number of technologies within that year in that scenario. So on this slide, I am presenting the national operating emissions at the national level for CO2 and PM. I should also mention that we include SOx and NOx in this analysis as well. But again, just for the purposes of the presentation, I'm going to focus on these two. We focus on CO2 and PM because we do recognize that CO2 is a global pollutant. So that would be a cause for concern about how local emissions impact everyone at a global level. Whereas if we're thinking about local impacts and distribution of emissions, then PM and that local like asthma, as well as cardiovascular and respiratory illnesses would be a concern for these local pollutants. So we see that the base case, which is that black line, and the 100% renewable energy by 2035 case, which is that blue dotted line with the squares, actually are at the max and min of our CO2 and PM emissions. We do find that all of the other scenarios will fall in between these two national decarbonization scenarios. And in general, of course, as we expect, we see a decreasing trend in terms of operating emissions. Now, one thing that we did investigate is not only operating, but life cycle emissions, because we know that some of those emissions have to be generated somewhere, as well as like mining the materials, building those power plants, because we're going to need to build a lot of extra capacity. And so one thing that is concerning is that we see that moving from 2020 to about 2030, we actually are seeing rises in the actual like life cycle PM emissions, just from having to build all of that capacity. And so that is one thing to consider as we're moving forward with energy transition. If we're decarbonization in and of itself will not necessarily minimize those co-pollutants, and some care should be taken to investigate where exactly these PM emissions are going to be generated to satisfy the demand in the US. Now, I want to acknowledge that we do not know exactly where the supply of these emissions are going to come from. The emissions associated with building those power plants will come from, but it is a concern. And again, the other scenarios will fall in between the base case and the low carbon by 2035 case. The regional life cycle emissions in 2050 will vary by scenario. And here we're going to stick with those three main scenarios I've been focusing on: the base case, the 100% renewable energy by 2035 case, and the low carbon by 2035 case. And so each map is a heat map. Oh, I should say that these regions that you see are the subnational regions that the Reed's model can go down to. So these are the lowest level that the Reed's model will allow us to get to. I do want to make the comment that some of these regions are as large as the state level. So when we're talking about distribution of air pollution emissions and other impacts, we are really talking about regional equality at the subnational level. And to get to like the census tract level, we would actually need more information about where those power plants would actually be built. So this again is a first step in understanding how a national decarbonization strategy will translate at the subnational level. So one of the things that, another thing is that the lighter the map, the less CO2 emissions per capita are there and from a life cycle basis. And then the darker the map, the darkest spot represents regions which have 20 tons of CO2 equivalent or more per capita. So one of the striking things is that by 2050, the base case has the lowest amount of regions at the lowest level, which is what we expected. And we actually see the total number of regions almost double in the 100% renewable energy by 2035 case. We're reaching 88% of regions at that lowest level. And even with a low carbon case, we see about 83% of the regions at the lowest level of CO2 emissions per capita. Now, if we're looking at operating emissions, it looks like a very different picture. So for operating emissions in terms of CO2, then under the base case, only 24% of regions are at the lowest level of CO2 emissions per capita. For in the 100% renewable energy by 2035 case, we reach 100% of our regions at that lowest level. But in the low carbon case, only 75% are reaching that lowest level. So one of the things to keep in mind here is that the 100% renewable energy by 2035 case is the only scenario for the CO2 emissions side. that reaches total equality in terms of CO2 emissions per capita. So you can live in the same area, no matter where you are, and have the same level of air quality. That's not necessarily the case for the low carbon case. And so one of the things to keep in mind is if our goal is total equality, then we need to have strict mandates on what technologies are allowed to generate and satisfy our energy demand. Now, of course, we know that CO2 emissions are at the global level, so they affect everyone. And we also investigate PM emissions or particulate matter emissions in 2050. Here we see that in the base case, we have 44% of regions at the lowest level of PM emissions. That's less than 2.5 kilograms of PM emissions per capita. In the renewable energy 100% by 2035 case, we actually see 70% of regions at that lowest level. In the low carbon case, we see almost 50% at that lowest level. So again, not allowing that natural gas plants to stay online, the coal plants to stay online, is like very good even for the co-pollutants, because we know that those technologies do not have as much of the life cycle emissions. But when we looked specifically at the operating emissions, we saw a slightly different picture. And that's because the 100% renewable energy by 2035 case allows biomass, which can have particulate matter emissions associated with it. And so here we see that when only looking at operating particulate matter emissions in 2050, we see that the base case had 57% of regions at the lowest level, whereas the renewable energy 100% by 2035 case had 84% of regions at that lowest level, whereas the low carbon case, because it kept on the natural gas with carbon capture and storage and CCS, as well as nuclear technology, we're able to not necessarily have to deploy as much biomass because those can supply a larger percent of the base load. So not only do we want to look at the distribution of those emissions, but we also want to tie those with our equity and equality indicators. Now we have a couple of indicators like the emissions ratio, which is going to look at the top 20 and bottom 20% of the most vulnerable groups. The Gini coefficient allows us to look at the distribution of emissions across groups. We have median income, energy burden, which is the percent of money that you spend on satisfying your energy needs, and the poverty rate in that area. And then we want to investigate the distribution of air pollution emissions and the distribution of energy jobs. So I'm going to focus on median income and the distribution of air pollution just for time's sake of this talk. And if anybody wants to talk more about the other ones, then please stay tuned for our forthcoming paper, which we will be submitting to a journal soon, but we can also, I'm happy to talk about those in this talk as well. So for median income, this is a map of how income is distributed across those regions, where the lightest part of this map is regions with an income of less than $50,000 a year. And the darkest part of this map is regions with an income of greater than $70,000 per year. So what we have done is we looked at how life cycle and operating emissions were distributed across those different income groups. And here we have the life cycle CO2 emissions across income group. The black line represents the lowest median income group, or that's the solid black line. The dotted black line represents the second lowest. The dotted red line represents the second highest, and the solid red line represents the highest income group. And the y-axis is the CO2 equivalent CO2 emissions per capita. So the blue line here is representing the emissions at that 5,000 kilograms per capita. And one of the things that we noticed is that that black line is always at the top across all years and in all of our scenarios. And so this could indicate that regions with highly vulnerable groups in terms of the median income are actually always the worst off across all of these scenarios. And that is something to consider as we are moving forward with energy transition. One thing to note is that the minimum of our base case is actually, exceeded in terms of the 100% renewable by 2035 case and our low carbon by 2035 case. So that is a benefit of having these strict technology requirements in terms of emissions reductions. And between the between the base case lowest group and the base case highest group, we actually see about like a 20,000 kilograms per capita difference, whereas in the 100% renewable by 2035 and the low carbon case is only about a 5,000 kilograms per capita difference. And so that is something to be said that is a positive note. And when we're looking at strictly operating emissions, I mean, it's even greater in terms of reaching total equality, where the base case, we see the emissions, again, following the same trends, but in the 100% by 2035 case for renewable energy and the low carbon case by 2035, we see everyone reaching total equality in terms of having zero operating emissions in their regions. And in the low carbon case, it's almost negligible, the difference between the vulnerable groups. Then, of course, we're focusing now on the local pollutants, and this is going to be the PM emissions across different income groups. One thing that's striking here is, again, we see that the lowest median income regions are traditionally the worst off, and they continue to be that way in terms of the life cycle PM emissions. And just, you know, as a reminder, PM emissions do result in higher instances of asthma and other health effects. And so with our base case and we see that there's actually an increasing trend of inequality, and that has to do with increasing the technology, but not necessarily retiring those coal and natural gas plants. While the highest income group is actually seeing reductions of their emissions over time. And while the 100% renewable energy by 2035 case and the low carbon case see in general a reduction, we see that it has a sharp decrease, and then for some reason in 2040 it starts to increase again. And so that is something that we would want to keep in mind in terms of, you know, the supply side of things and the emissions associated with building out this energy capacity. With the operating emissions, so places that are actually consuming that electricity, we do see that everybody reaches equality in that 100% renewable energy by 2035 case, as well as the low carbon case, not so much in the base case. And so that is something that we want to keep in mind as we are having these strict policy mandates. Now, one question that may be burning in everybody's minds is, you know, what happens if this technology mandate moves out a bit? So instead of the 100% by 2035, what if we now have our target set at 2050? And we see that that actually just extends, you know, how long it takes us to reach equality. Now, a benefit is that we see decreasing trends over time. But again, until that mandate is actually instituted, we do not see like total equality in the system. And so one thing to keep in mind here is that these are driven by least cost paradigms. And so a big finding here is that the least cost paradigm does not necessarily guarantee total equality even though you're using a national decarbonization objective. So just to summarize some of the results, we find that, of course, national emissions are decreasing, but this does not guarantee that the co-pollutants will decrease at the same rate as the CO2 emissions. So we want to keep in mind how those co-pollutants will be affected by energy transition and include that when we are thinking about decarbonization objectives. In terms of distributional equity, we find that low-income communities can be considered to be worse off in terms of local PM emissions, and high-income communities continue to be the best off. And CO2 emissions decrease across all regions, but low-income communities, again, are still the highest. And so as we are moving forward with energy transition, we want to consider how we can not only reduce the total national emissions, but also reduce emissions across regions in an equitable way. So future work involves performing a cost analysis for how the costs of energy transitions will be distributed across regions, as well as considering additional equality metrics like energy jobs and additional sustainability metrics such as land use and water use. And then, of course, tying this all together in a trade-off analysis so that we can know exactly where we're winning and losing in terms of energy transition. So if you remember nothing else from this talk, I hope that you take away that, you know, from using our national decarbonization model tied with a sustainability and equality analysis, we have shown that least cost optimization misses the equality objectives and may leave vulnerable regions worse off. And as we are considering the trade-offs between decarbonization objectives and reaching this equitable and total equality that we have strived for, we want to make sure that we are considering that in our actual objective and decision-making paradigms. I would be remiss if I did not thank my PhD students for working with this, working with my group, as particularly Tegan Goforth, who has been leading this analysis. And we would also like to acknowledge support from the National Science Foundation, as well as the Wilson E. Scott Institute for Energy Innovation at Carnegie Mellon. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Destiny. That was really great presentation, and really appreciated the interactive portion as well. And Julie, if you want to just let me know how many minutes we have in the chat session for Q&A, because I'm not sure if we're running behind schedule or not. But so one question that that I have is is about the energy transition and all of the different innovations and scientific advancements that we're developing, disruptive technologies. All of these things come with, as a whole host of impacts that arise throughout the entire life cycle. And oftentimes these occur in emerging market supply chains, and many of those today are unquantified. I mean, so import reliant minerals, the mining and processing and trading overseas, the corrupt government regimes and the social imbalances that this creates, and also the lack of environmental health safety laws and labor laws in these developing economy supply chains, waste disposal practices, all of these things, that really overall impact the sustainability profile when we look at things, from this holistic lens. So, in a sense, we have this massively glaring blind spot when we analyze the true costs of new energy technologies, because, what happens across the life has considerable influence on its score. And so your research creates all of these new models that factor in positive social outcomes, and you're not just focused on cost and reliability metrics. So in the context of transitioning to a circular economy, another really popular principle that we're gravitating towards, how do you suggest governments and industries account for all of these different social equity and environmental impacts across the entire value chain that includes many of these currently unquantified impacts that fall outside of traditional emissions analysis? How do we measure that equity outcome?
Yeah, no pressure. So I think that a big challenge is trying to understand what our current equality goal is and what type of equality we're trying to reach. So when I'm thinking about involving multiple governments at an international level, then you're really trying to get at that international equality. And so you maybe want to make sure that different countries are being paid fairly for the materials, right? We're not necessarily picking up the materials from developing countries and then making all the technologies and using those in developed countries and then dropping all the waste in developing countries, right? And so then making sure that people are paid fairly, have access to those jobs, as well as do not bear the brunt of the air pollution emissions that are used to mine those materials and are also generated in these other countries but still affect them. So I think that we need multiple models to understand all these different impacts. One of the things that we are trained as a modeler is that all models are wrong and some of them are useful. And so I don't think that it all can be combined into one model. I think that we need supply chain models to understand how the flows of materials will change as demands for different technology changes. And then understanding okay, if we're starting to see scarcity and that scarcity is all accruing in one place, potentially that's opening the doors for trying to preemptively put money towards other materials that can be used to make solar panels or new energy technologies or those disruptive technologies. And if we're doing that as early as possible, hopefully that can lead to less conflict in these material rich countries.
Yeah, and that's a really important point is how do we quantify all of that and bring all all of that together, because many of our decisions and the policies that we're creating today to push for circularity and to push for sustainability, both two very different concepts that have two very different paths to realization and timescales. Many of those are contradictory, and so we could end up, shifting some of that social and economic burden elsewhere. And so when we look at when we look at measuring these things, like how, I guess right now, many of the decisions are informed by life cycle assessments, and there's a lot of inconsistencies with that and lack of standardization. Traditionally looks at emissions with that, but there is there's work in looking at things much more holistically, using the sustainability life cycle assessments and integrating those with life cycle costing and the traditional assessments. Is that something that that you're involved in when looking at these things?
So I have not been working on performing life cycle assessments. Typically I use them in our analysis, and I'm more on the modeling side. But I do know that there is a lot of work in terms of integrating these social factors into life cycle assessments. So looking at how technologies have led to distribution of jobs and access of jobs and impacting equality and those other metrics. And I think that that's a very important part of this entire research domain in terms of understanding the impacts of technology deployment. Again, because we're not deploying technologies because we just love them. We're deploying them because we want to reach certain objectives. And as we are trying to move forward with equitable transitions and sustainable transitions, there are a lot of uncertainties about how these previous deployments of technologies have impacted communities. And there's a lot of work in the environmental justice as well as environmental racism literature, but getting that hybrid between engineering and environmental justice, I think, is coming to the forefront now. And there's just so much opportunity to be done that we really need to understand what has driven technologies to have equitable or inequitable impacts, and how does that change over the life cycle of different technologies?
Yeah, it's definitely a multidisciplinary approach that's going to have to be taken that integrates all of these different disciplines into that. And certainly many of our decisions, throughout this are going to be informed by these assessments. And so it's really going to be a balance of that desire for perceived sustainability, what most people think sustainability is, with the reality of what the data says, because oftentimes, as we see in many life cycle assessments, the results could run counter to conventional wisdom or our own personal values. And so that's another challenge for people, in this as well. So I've got a question from the audience, and it is it legitimate to claim that bringing energy jobs to rural communities is an undesirable form of gentrification?
So I would say that that's not a legitimate claim personally, just based on talking to community leaders as well as other stakeholders in this field. So I mean, one part of it is gentrification has a lot to do with the policies and access that people have to those jobs. So for example, if you are bringing in energy jobs to a rural community, or even a sub-peri-urban community, but you're not providing access in terms of transportation, there's no bus routes, you're not bringing high quality jobs, then it can lead to gentrification. If, for example, everybody who had to move to this community had to have a car, and then you were kind of putting it next to a place where a lot of people didn't have cars, right? But energy jobs in terms of the fossil fuel industry have definitely, I would say, reversed gentrification, because most people don't want to live next to a fossil fuel plant that's outputting waste into a river or the air. And so then you typically will see marginalized communities such as African Americans, low income, and Hispanics living closer to these plants. And so that, I would say, is I guess anti-gentrification, but it depends on what technology it is. I mean, wind turbines are very spread out. And so what I've heard of is those being connected to farmers and put on farmland where you don't actually have a lot of people living there anyway, but it helps sustain the farm. So I think it truly depends on the technology that you're talking about.
Well, Dr. Nock, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really intriguing. And we do have to move on to our